To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land.
Communist threat of domination.
Development of ICBM type.
Maintain white supremacy even if it had to murder children.
Sino-American relations.
Disneyland is dedicated to the ideals, the dreams, and the hard facts that have created America.
On opening day, when Walt Disney said that Disneyland is your land, who is the you that he was referring to? And what about those hard facts that built America? Because the history of the United States that I know is actually pretty hard. It doesn't look like a Disney movie. Despite the performative wokeness of the modern Walt Disney Company, these leftover ideologies of 19th and 20th century Occidental colonialism is so foundational to the interactive story that is Disneyland that you can't have a Disneyland without it. So buckle in. Here we go. This story takes place not at Disneyland's opening in 1955, but decades earlier. We're talking about Disneyland's predecessor, the World's Fairs. World's Fairs used to be the thing, especially around the turn of the century. They were happening every couple years and they were absolutely rad. They were essentially cities constructed to showcase new technologies, scientific discoveries, and products. If your new technology didn't premiere at a World's Fair between 1850 and 1950, it wasn't shit. But in effect, World's Fairs were really sites to celebrate two things: industrialism and colonialism. At the center of most World's Fairs were different pavilions dedicated to a private company or an organization centered around a new manufacturing technology. Here at the New York World's Fair in 1939, you can see a demonstration in breakthroughs in car making at the Ford Pavilion.
In another exhibit, safety glass for Ford windshields is made.
Ooh, can't miss the upholstery exhibit. Now these pavilions and showcases were the respectable part of the World's Fairs. Then pushed somewhere onto the outskirts of the fair was the fun part, the midway. This is where the rides were, and the fun houses and freak shows. At the Columbia Exposition in Chicago in 1895, you'd find the first Ferris wheel on the midway. Now the midway is where you would often find the ethnology exhibits, a nice way to say human zoos. This is where people from colonized countries would be rounded up and made to perform for the mostly white fairgoers.
Tunisia, like other villages at the fair, peoples an accurate setting with authentic characters.
Let's take a look at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. It was created to showcase two things. The first was the taming of Niagara Falls, to use for hydropower.
The mightiest cataract in the Western Hemisphere.
And the second was to show off the spoils of the Spanish-American War and the illicit annexation of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So what attractions might you see if you were strolling down the midway at the Buffalo World's Fair? Well, let's take a look at the official catalog. At the Hawaiian Village and Theater, you could see the famous Hulu Hulu dancing girls, who dance this graceful measure as its only dance to royalty. Only since the US State Department led a coup of the autonomous Hawaiian government, overthrowing their rightful queen for the American sugar companies, it could be danced for the ogling masses. At the Philippine Village, you could see all the races inhabiting the islands, ranging from cannibalism to the highest degree of civilization. Not on display are the American inhabitants, who ran the nation as a US colony for 35 years, during which time thousands of native people were put into concentration camps, and between 200,000 and a million civilians were murdered. Well, things don't fare much better stateside, because you can visit the Indian Congress, where you can see long-haired painted savages in all their barbaric splendor. Yikes.
The world has come a long way since then. This is what we call our Imagineering department. It's where we dream up our new projects for Disneyland or World's Fair. When we needed a cast of lifelike figures for our most ambitious project, Disneyland, we found ourselves in this new field of animation in a big way. As Adventureland grew, new inhabitants were added to the jungles.
Fast forward to 1955, Disneyland opens to the public. It was different from the fairs and seaside amusement parks that came before it for two reasons. The first, that it was safe. At Disneyland, you're not going to get scammed by a carnival game, you're not going to get solicited by sex workers, and you're most likely not going to get in a fight with a drunk patron, all things that were common at World's Fairs. The second was, instead of being a collage of rides and attractions, Disneyland was built on the principles of storytelling. It's a narrative that the attendee experiences in the first person. I think Bob Iger put it well when he said, "The experience people have when they spend time in our parks is immersive. They not only hear and see our stories, but they actually enter them. They live in them." So let's take a look at Disneyland as an interactive story, and start where most stories start, in the first act. Now, stories occur in two main spaces, the known world and the unknown world. The first act establishes the known world. This is the home world to the protagonist. Then there's some sort of call to action that pulls the protagonist into an unknown world. Now that's the space where the things we understood in the first act are flipped upside down.
That's no moon.
Where things are different and scary. And the protagonist, in the case of the Disneyland story, you, must overcome challenges in this foreign land. Now, the known world doesn't have to be familiar to the audience before they engage with the story. Let's look at The Little Mermaid, for example. She lives in a world that's pretty different from ours. I mean, she talks to fish and stuff. But the first act of The Little Mermaid establishes the rules, politics, relationships, economies, and conflicts, so that when Ariel ventures into her unknown world, the world on land, we can see this contrast. So let's take this structure and journey through Walt's original Disneyland, and see it as you would experience it as a visitor.
But let's join the crowds at the beginning of Main Street, USA. Here is a typical small town of the 1890s. Completely authentic in every aspect, yet it's brand new, spick and span, the only one of its kind in existence today.
Your story starts on Main Street, USA, modeled after Walt's hometown of Marceline, Missouri. It's this model of your perfect Midwestern town of the Gilded Age or turn of the century, the time period that was the height of the World's Fairs, where residents of Marceline might take a train from Kansas City to Chicago or Buffalo to see the exotic people on display at those cities' World's Fairs. Main Street is the known world of your story. This is the baseline that all the unusual, exceptional things of the other lands will be compared to. There's no rides in this known world of yours, because, like in the first act of stories, you haven't really encountered any real tests or challenges. The common trope of Disneyland rides, where your normal tour is derailed when something goes horribly wrong, that's not present here. Main Street is a space of safety and comfort. Once we make it to the hub, the central plaza at the heart of Disneyland, we're presented with 4 unknown worlds, where we can start our adventure. Let's work around this in a clockwise fashion, as most people do. The first threshold we cross is that into Adventureland.
If somebody, let's say in the 1850s or 60s in Paris or London, wished to talk about or read about India or Egypt or Syria, there would be very little chance for that person to simply address the subject, as we like to think, in a kind of free and creative way. There was a kind of repertory of images that kept coming up, the sensual woman. The East is a kind of mysterious place full of secrets and monsters. And then you read somebody in the 1920s, and they're more or less saying the same thing. So there develops a kind of image of the timeless Orient, as if the Orient, unlike the West, doesn't develop, it stays the same. And that's one of the problems with Orientalism, is it creates an image outside of history, of something that is placid and still and, eternal, which is simply contradicted by the facts of history. You see, so in that one sense, it's a creation of you might say an ideal other.
Adventureland is the land most rife with these othered cliches, and that land that takes most heavily from the colonial and racist midways of the past.
Hark, the jungle drums are calling. That's the Tahitian group I was telling you about. The show's starting right over there.
This is a land where, just like in the Buffalo World's Fair, we can see exotic dances of the Pacific. And the fetishization of its indigenous women is on full display as we watch these hungry, leering eyes of white Disneyland visitors. Gross, dude. Chill. You can also visit the Enchanted Tiki Room. For most of its life, the attraction was sponsored by the Dole Fruit Company, a company founded by James Dole, the cousin of Sanford Dole, a man who was instrumental in the coup that overthrew Hawaii's monarchy and opened up the nation to be exploited by British and American corporations. The next threshold we cross leads us into Frontierland.
It's but a short walk into Frontierland and our country's historic past.
The West was a wild place when viewed by a Midwesterner around the turn of the century. Here you can experience the danger and thrills of quote-unquote untamed wilderness as you bravely make your way across the continent, take a donkey ride through our nation's colorful deserts, or throw on your coonskin cap and test your riflery like America's formative rebel Davy Crockett. But the shadow of the World's Fair's ethnology exhibits are cast here too, by the Mexican village and Indian village.
Braves from many tribes are represented here. These tribal dances and centuries-old customs have been handed down from generation to generation. Such groups help fulfill the purpose for which Frontierland was intended, the perpetuation of our country's heritage.
Now, the Indian village was a huge draw. Native Americans from all over the country are ready to perform at the beck and call of the mouse from Disneyland's opening until 1971.
Wait a minute. I think it's just 4:30 now.
Oh, look! Oh!
God bless you, Kurt Russell. And can I just point out how weird looking the Frito Kid is? Why was this ever a mascot? Now, even the other two lands that were there on opening day, Fantasyland and Tomorrowland, can't help but portray elements of this colonialism.
Pioneers who passed this way stretched the country from sea to sea. They brought something even more important to this wilderness, perhaps the most important of all American rights, the right to vote, to choose a government that would protect their rights and fulfill their needs.
The right to vote? Bro, Native Americans couldn't even vote in all 50 states until 1962. I mean, what were these guys thinking? Now, this is all the original Disneyland, built in California in 1955, and that was a while ago, right? Is this reliance on colonial ideology essential in all the other parks built around the world? I mean, especially when those parks are built in historically othered spaces. What happens when your unknown world starts to look like the known world of your visitors? Who is the you in this story that's told in the second person? Hong Kong Disneyland is probably the international park that looks the most like the original Disneyland. Compare these views from Main Street, it's almost identical. But those mountains in the background are an indicator of some of the stark differences from the domestic parks. They're said to resemble a white tiger and dragon. The Walt Disney Company tried to do its cultural due diligence while designing this Asian Disneyland. The mouse received major backlash for its insensitivity at the opening of its French park in 1992 when they didn't serve wine, and even more recently in China itself for westernizing the main character of its animated feature Mulan in 1998. Hong Kong Disneyland opened in 2005 at a time where China started to flex its muscle as an international consumer economy with a growing middle class. This was the same year that China banned this Nike commercial because all advertisements in China should uphold national dignity and interest and respect the motherland's culture. So the Walt Disney Company hired some cultural advisors and feng shui masters to help tap the proper forces of the natural elements, hence the Dragon and Tiger Hills. While there are some small Asian elements in the park, like traditional Chinese food on Main Street, this is still a theme park from a Western perspective. I mean, Disney executives said just before it opened that they wanted to give Asian visitors an authentic, immersive Disney experience, with all its storytelling and Western trappings. Essentially saying this is the same colonial-influenced Disneyland that the rest of the world has seen. So let's take a quick tour of this small park to experience the interactive narrative that's being told. Again, you start in a turn-of-the-century Midwestern America. Then you break left and cross a threshold into Adventureland. Interestingly, with a Buddhist statue. What does this say about exoticism and adventure when you're in a region where Buddha statues are common? I mean, Hong Kong Disneyland's only 20 miles away from a notable Buddhist statue. If you're from Hong Kong or mainland China, there's a chance that statues like this are part of your actual worship, and not just general symbols of adventure. You continue your journey into Grizzly Gulch, your frontierland, a send-up to the American West at the end of the 19th century, interestingly leaving absent the contributions of Chinese immigrants in the colonization of the western states. Also left out decades of slave-like conditions for Chinese laborers and laws precluding Chinese immigration, but we'll give them artistic license. Next, you cross into Mystic Point, which is a small land to showcase just one ride, and this one is something. Mystic Manor is what Hong Kong Disneyland has in place of the Haunted Mansion. See, there are topics that just can't be imported into China, and Haunted Mansion's ghosts and spirituality is a no-go, even in Hong Kong. Instead, what you get is a tour through an eccentric adventurer's personal collection that goes horribly wrong when his pet monkey unleashes magic from an enchanted music box. So your experience really starts outside the show's facade. It's a distinctly Occidental Victorian home. But this one happens to have a few Eastern architectural elements. First, you have the minaret. It's common in the Middle East and Russia, but also apparent in India and East China. On this tower, you see these windows have arches that are distinctly Islamic, and the polygonal tower itself might be a reference to a pagoda. And this round element is reminiscent of the moon gate, which is a traditional element in Chinese gardens. So how does this collage of architectural styles add to the narrative of this part of the park? Well, you'll find your answer when you get on the ride. Mystic Manor is the story of Lord Mystic, a member of the fictional Society of Explorers and Adventurers. This club is based on real-life clubs like the Explorers Club. Now, the Explorers Club was founded in 1904 as a fraternity almost exclusively of white adventurers, under this dubious assertion that a place can't be explored unless done by whites. So Lord Mystic invites you to explore his collection of artifacts. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt and assume they're not all just stolen. But of course something goes wrong, and adventure ensues. Wait, let's step back and take a look at Lord Mystic himself for a second.
Lord Henry here, he's an earnest guy. You know, he's part of the British upper class, well-educated, traveled the world.
He's a straight-up British colonizer living in Hong Kong. Now, just to cover my bases, Britain held Hong Kong as a colony for 157 years, starting at the end of the Opium Wars, and it only ceded Hong Kong back to China in 1997. So here you see the British Henry Mystic and his pet monkey Albert, who, for some reason, is wearing a traditional Chinese robe. Wait, did he just say ni hao? When you've got a human playing a colonizer, and an animal representing the native person, well, that's just kind of revealing, isn't it?
They love each other. It's really a father and son-like relationship.
And why does it have to be all weird and paternal? Look, I'm not going to say I understand all of the intricacies of the Hong Kong identity, or even Chinese culture in general, so maybe being compared to a monkey isn't that offensive, but it's not a Chinese story. This is a story explicitly told from a Western perspective, and specifically from the perspective of a colonizer. So Mystic Manor and Hong Kong Disney in general is a really interesting site to explore the colonialist storytelling in a recently colonized space. Now, Hong Kong Disneyland was really just a testing ground to see if this kind of storytelling would work in China. Fast forward 11 years.
One of our biggest dreams was to bring Disneyland, that great, iconic, wonderful place created by Walt Disney in the 50s, to China, the most populous country in the world. The best place to do that was Shanghai, its largest and most vibrant city.
Shanghai, baby, the economic heart of the People's Republic of China, the world's most populous country. This is the home of Disney's newest park, built at a cost of $3.5 billion. Once again, your story starts on Main Street, USA, except this isn't Main Street. It's Mickey Avenue. Gone are the 1890s Midwest vibes. Here you've got Victorian, next to a Swiss chalet, next to like a French Renaissance. It's across the street from the Carthay Circle Theater's 20s Spanish revival. I mean, this isn't a place. This is a cartoon. Like, this is Disney. which makes sense because a lot of mainland Chinese aren't familiar with Disney, especially adults. But Mickey Avenue isn't your complete first act at Shanghai Disneyland. It only takes you halfway to the castle. In the other half, you find Gardens of Imagination. It's based on a classic Chinese garden, but here you have Disney characters translated into the 12 signs of the Chinese zodiac. This is your real known world. This is your first act. So now, you finally reached the hub. You're ready to cross the threshold into the unknown worlds, the places of adventure. If you were an Occidental, like me, you would probably start at the 9 o'clock position, like we did in the other parks. But if you grew up writing in Mandarin or Cantonese, you wouldn't necessarily do the park in a clockwise fashion. But whatever, today we're just going to go left. And what you find is Tomorrowland. Look, the order of this park is flipped compared to the other parks. In Tomorrowland, you've got Tron. It's very thrilling. Let's move on. You continue clockwise and then into, what's this? Treasure Cove and Adventure Isle.
This is 2016, and things have changed. So Frontierland, we didn't believe belonged here. So someone came with the idea of, well, let's build Pirate Cove and turn that into a land.
This park straight up doesn't have a Frontierland or Adventureland. Instead, they have one land themed after the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, which were absolutely enormous in China. And then you have Adventure Isle, which really shies away from the Gilded Age exoticism of Asia and the Pacific Islands. At first, it seems like this modern, anti-colonial representation of the concept of adventure. You've got a river rapids ride, a ropes course, soaring over the horizon. Look, it's a personal adventure. You're testing your strength and resolve. It's not the kind of adventure that relies on the conquest of othered people. Until you look at the story that's hidden in the details of Adventure Isle. This narrative has you tour the exotic land that was discovered by the League of Adventurers, not to be confused with Henry Mystic's Society of Explorers and Adventurers. I don't know why you need two, but the League of Adventurers crash-landed on Adventure Isle in 1935, and were greeted by the friendly and welcoming Arbori people. Their culture and mythology is woven into the background of most of the rides at Adventure Isle. I mean, here you can see an Arbori woman showing you how to put restraints on soaring over the horizon. What's the point of this background narrative? Why invent these Arbori people? Well, let's really analyze this. Arbori most certainly comes from the Latin arbor for tree. So creating this connection to nature or reliance on nature. Maybe let's look at their costumes for more clues. You've got this guy up front who looks like something out of the Lion King Broadway show. So another connection to Africa. Behind him, you've got this headdress that looks like something you might see at Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, which in turn looks like an indigenous Brazilian headdress. And after that, you see something that's really reminiscent of Southeast Asia, like you might see in Thailand or Myanmar. So what are important about these three regions?
Our attention was drawn to articles accusing China of economically exploiting countries around the world. So is China's unprecedented development cause for concern or celebration?
China's hunger for commodities like grains from Brazil seems endless, and shipping them halfway around the globe is a task that demands infrastructure and investment.
While driving through Thailand's industrial zone in Rayong are Chinese factories. Chinese investors are searching abroad for growth, and Thailand is a hot investment destination.
With some going so far as to say it's on the verge of being a colonialist power.
So there you have it. This isn't some sort of anti-colonialist reimagining of Adventureland. This is just translating that narrative to represent the new colonization for this new developing nation. Because what's the goal of this Orientalist-style essentialism, if not to prime the minds of those in economic power, to accept them as fodder for exploitive capitalism? But I don't know, maybe it's just a theme park. So let's come back to California. Surely, in this 21st century, your highly developed nation has no need to lace colonial ideals into its new stories.
You did something very interesting with Star Wars. It was a very anti-authoritarian, very kind of 60s against the man kind of thing, nested deep inside of a fantasy.
Or a colonial, You know, we're fighting the largest empire in the world.
Right.
And we're just a bunch of hayseeds in coonskin hats that don't know nothing.
That's right.
And it was the same thing with the Vietnamese.
Yep.
The irony of that one is in both of those, the little guys won.
Right.
And the big, highly technical empire,
the English Empire, right?
The English Empire, the American Empire, lost.
Yeah.
That was the whole point.
Now, what's the effect of this foundational tale of colonialism in the Disneyland story? Since it's a narrative of a white, turn-of-the-century Midwesterner going on adventures in exotic lands, does that mean it can only be experienced by someone who has a similar identity to that? Disney is just as happy to take a white person's money as it is to take the money of a Native American or an Asian person, and Disney's not blind to the exclusionary implications of their narratives. I mean, this clip from The Magic of Walt Disney World in 1972 even makes a sly reference to modern advances in civil rights.
Here, the good old days are better than the good old days ever were, and everybody and anybody can join in the fun.
And in a TV tour of the original park in 1957, just 2 years after it opened, we can see two women enjoying Main Street in traditional Indian clothing, moments before crossing the threshold into Adventureland. What does this contrast say about these visitors, or people that look or dress like them? To me, it's both an acknowledgement of these colonialist tropes, but also a clear welcome to Asian and Asian Americans. But you can't ignore the fact that it is inherently exclusionary. And you can't expect the Walt Disney Company to change that. Disneyland is your land. And at the end of the day, it does reflect these hard facts that built America. The facts are hard. For you to enjoy a refreshing Dole Whip today, the us of yesterday had to secretly overthrow a beloved queen. The train ride that you enjoy today was built on the broken bodies of people that we enslaved yesterday. Even the land that this park was built on was taken through centuries of genocide and state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing. And you don't just enjoy the spoils of it, you revel in it. These atrocities of human history are entertainment for us. They're the details etched into the rocks. They're the backstories, the comic relief. Not because we understand these things to be lighthearted, but because these colonial ideas are essential to the interactive narrative that is Disneyland.
This land was made for you and me.
Now let's go out on this fun little clip from the wonderful world of Disney, where Donny Osmond and the kids of the kingdom riff on Woody Guthrie's biting indictment of private ownership.
From the South Sea Islands to the Cascade Highlands. This land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me.